Hey guys, welcome to another LitReview where I dumb down scientific journal articles to my level. In today's video, the article that we'll be discussing is titled Effect of Posterior Malleolus Fracture on Syndesmotic Reduction, a Cadaveric Study. It is written by Dr. Fitzpatrick et al. From University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. So there are a lot of debates, more recent debates about whether or not you should fixate posterior malleolus on an ankle fracture. And we are taught that any posterior malleolus fracture that encompasses more than 25% of the articular surface, then it warrants a surgical correction. And in this article, we were not talking about how to fixate posterior malleolus, but it's just talking about how posterior malleolus will impact syndesmotic reduction, because oftentimes with the ankle injury, where you have a posterior malleolus fracture, you often have a syndesmotic injury, and that's seen intraoperatively by diastasis of the tibia and fibula. But they wanted to use a cadaveric limb to kind of evaluate what are the really factors that affect the syndesmotic reduction. So the way they did it was they got 9 cadaveric limbs. 5 of them they made it so that it would be considered large posterior malleolus fracture, and 4 of them a small posterior malleolus fracture. And the way they created this posterior malleolus fracture are they cut through the tibial incisura at a 21-degree angle, and if it was at a 2/3 mark of the incisura, they considered a large posterior malleolus, and if it was a 1/3, then they considered a small posterior malleolus. And then within each cadaveric limb, with the posterior malleolus fracture that they created, that simulated SCR4, by the way, they did 3 different types of fixation, or categories of kind of fixation. One was they did not fixate anything. It was a non-reduced, non-displaced fracture, basically just a cut by itself. And then the second type of fixation was an anatomic reduction with just an AP, anterior posterior screw, that is fixating the posterior mal. And then the third type of reduction was a mal gap. They called it gap mal reduction, meaning they put a piece of wooden splinter about 4.5 millimeter between the fracture, and they fixated it similarly with the anterior posterior screw. And after they fixated it, they clamped down the fibula and tibia at about 1 centimeter proximal to the tibio-talar joint to kind of simulate this syndesmotic reduction. Okay. And they want to see how the fibula would deviate in anterior-posterior direction and a medial-lateral direction. And they evaluated the displacement of the fibula using a CT imaging. So what they did was they kind of used iteration algorithm to figure out what is the proper quote-unquote place of the fibula, and then after the appropriate fixation, they evaluated, they compared where the fibula should be with the CT image that they get from after each syndesmotic, after clamping of the tibia and the fibula. And what they found out was for in an anterior and posterior direction, the fibular displacement, the fracture fragment, and the way you fixate did not matter, at least for the non-displaced, non-reduced, and anatomic reduction. You still get this small amount of displacement in the anterior-posterior, mainly the anterior direction of those two. But again, the fracture fragment and the way you fix it doesn't really matter, except for gap mal reduction, where it resulted in a posterior displacement of the fibula, especially with the large fragment. Now, for the medial and lateral direction, the fracture fragment size did not matter, but in this case, the type of reduction did matter. Again, the gap mal reduction, mal-reduced posterior malleolus behaved differently than the other two, the non-reduced, non-displaced, and a anatomically reduced posterior malleolus. The first two I mentioned deviated medially, the fibula, but for the gap mal reduction, it displaced laterally. So it's just interesting how gap mal reduction just behaves differently than the other two way of fixation, quote unquote. And a couple of things about this study is a cadaveric study, so it's a level 5. It's not as strong with 9 limbs, but one thing I really liked about the paper was just their innovative way to design this experiment to simulate ankle fracture that is kind of clinically seen with a posterior malleolus fracture. I thought that was a pretty cool way to simulate fracture. But again, the weakness of the study, I think, is they just made a lot of assumptions on what they thought was a posterior malleolus fracture. And their assumptions can be correct in certain situations, but again, just being a cadaveric study, there's going to be times where in clinical setting it may not be reliable. I think the main point of this article kind of adds on to the side where posterior malleolus fracture should be fixated regardless of its fracture fragment size. Because they illustrated in here, the anterior, posterior, and medial lateral displacement did not associate with the fracture fragment size. And there are there's a literature, systematic review done by Odak that reviews a similar fashion where the severity had nothing to do with the posterior malleolus fracture fragment size. And also there's a paper from Gardner that talks about how you get a better syndesmotic stiffness when you reduce the posterior malleolus fracture instead of the syndesmotic screw, essentially. So this research kind of adds on to that, saying that the fracture fragment size does not really matter. The important thing is you should reduce posterior malleolus fracture regardless of the size, based on the integrity of the ankle stability. If the anterior inferior tib fib and posterior inferior tib fib and those interosseous ligaments are compromised, that makes up the syndesmosis, then you should most likely fixate the posterior malleolus fracture, even if it composes a very small fraction of the articular surface. So that's the gist about this paper. It was an interesting way how they designed it. I think it was pretty cool. Overall, I thought the article was pretty cool. I like the methodology. And that's it for this paper. I really appreciate you guys watching my videos. I've been slacking a little bit in terms of my production, but just please bear with me, and I really do appreciate each and one of you that watches my video. And tune in for my next video. And thanks again for watching.